Welcome to the Kindle Chronicles, the Friday podcast all about your Kindle. I'm Len Edgerly. Today is November 10th, 2017. Greetings from Cambridge, Massachusetts, where this week Darlene and I babysat grandsons Jake and Ryan, 4 and almost 2 years old, for 5 days and nights while my daughter and her husband celebrated their 5th anniversary in the Caribbean. The experience left me exhausted, exhilarated, and pretty much in awe of the work that good parents like Mike and Rue do every day and night for years. One of my favorite times during the week was putting Ryan to bed while Darlene did the same for Jake in the next room. One night as Ryan climbed the stairs at bedtime, he kept saying, "Book, book," over and over because he knew the nightly routine was going to include an active reading session in the upholstered rocking chair after I zipped him into his sleep sack. He had some books that had little flaps that on each page he could open up a flap and reveal something underneath it, kind of like the old advent calendars I remember as a kid. Here's a snippet that I recorded with the new iPhone 10 that I placed on the changing table.
We're going to read a book and then we're going to go to bed.
Book.
Yeah.
Book.
I plan to play some more of that nighttime conversation with Ryan at the end of the show as the outro. You will hear a much longer conversation this week with my guest Carlina Duan, a poet in her early 20s whose debut collection, I Wore My Blackest Hair, will be published by Amazon's Little A imprint on November 14th. In addition to her own writing, Carlina teaches writing to young students. It makes me hope that Ryan and Jake's current love of books will develop into a love of doing their own writing someday, perhaps with guidance from teachers with Carlina's passion and insight.
The really powerful thing with writing is that I think it can offer students a way to kind of amplify themselves and write themselves into existence. That, for me, growing up was so powerful.
First up in news is an intriguing Brad Stone interview that I heard about via listener David Enzel. Brad called into the Wall Street Journal's Moneybeat Book Club podcast on November 4th to talk about his 2012 book, The Everything Store, which in my mind still remains the definitive profile of Amazon and Jeff Bezos. The Journal's podcasters asked Brad what has changed since his book came out and what he would add if he updated it. Here is an excerpt.
You know, I've thought about that a lot. The 5th anniversary of the original publication of the book is coming up, and I was thinking about updating it. I mean, so much has changed. I just looked. The stock since publication day is up 252%. So if only I'd taken my book advance and just invested in Amazon stock, I would have been in good shape.
Right.
I did do a paperback update the following year, but, I mean, so much has changed, right? Mm-hmm. And I try, when I write, you know, in my book writing about technology companies, I think about future-proofing it. You know, how can I leave and the reader in the episode kind of prepared for what's coming? And, you know, I did, you know, I remember one kind of phrase I have at the end of the book where I say that the answer to every question with Amazon is yes. You know, will they get into groceries? Yes. Will they, you know, expand around the world? Yes, because they're a company of unlimited ambition. But, you know, I definitely could not have foreseen, the boom in Amazon Web Services, the cloud business, just almost $5 billion in revenue last quarter. The boom in Alexa and Amazon's establishing itself as like an AI company. They had a hard time with hardware, and they went and sort of lapped Apple and Google with the first Echo and established Alexa as the kind of dominant home, assistant. And, you know, these are all things that, you kind of want the book back because it's such a great story. At the same time, you know, at the time Amazon was embroiled in this battle with the book industry, which now in retrospect seems, you know, very much drama from 5 years ago. So a lot has changed.
Given the increasing interest in Amazon, I wouldn't be surprised to see Brad Stone update the Everything Store before too long. I also noted with interest his reference to the contentious and highly public contract dispute between Amazon and the big publishers, and I agree that it seems very much like old news at this point as the publishers proceed on their merry overpricing of ebooks, a right they apparently won when the dispute finally ended in new contracts. I always wonder about this when I hear people like Senator Al Franken worry about Amazon's power over publishers. If Amazon is so powerful, how come the result of the last negotiations was the companies caving on the one point they most publicly argued for, which was competitive ebook prices? It just doesn't add up. As it happens, next week will mark 3 years since Amazon and Hachette announced agreement on contract terms. I wonder if that means they might be in the middle of new contract negotiations now. If so, I don't expect to read any leaked reports about the talks. Certainly Amazon won't want a repeat of the pasting it received mainly in the New York Times, which was acting as the PR arm of Hachette last time around, in my opinion. I doubt Hachette and the other publishers relish the publicity either, because experienced contract negotiators have better odds of reaching agreement if their work takes place behind closed doors in an environment of mutual trust. Brad Stone also mentioned the surprise of Amazon's purchase of Whole Foods, and this week Amazon announced that the grocer formerly known as Whole Paycheck is going to be selling Amazon tech devices as well as lettuce and salmon. The company says it will turn more than 100 of the more than 460 Whole Foods stores into places where you will be able to buy Echoes, Fire tablets, and other devices. A more limited number of Whole Foods locations are going to have staffed pop-up stores that will give customers a chance to actually try out devices the way you can at a brick-and-mortar Amazon bookstore. The pop-up locations will be Chicago, Denver, Rochester Hills, Michigan, Davie, Florida, and Pasadena, California. As it happens, a new Whole Foods is opening this month just a few blocks from where Darlene and I live when we're in Denver, in lower downtown, Lodo. So that might be one that's selling Kindles as well as kale, to borrow from a headline in the Seattle Times. I look forward to checking it out. Here in Boston, Prime Now is making amazing delivery happen. Our new home in Cambridge is an untidy sprawl of stuff not yet organized in any way, and most of our belongings are in storage awaiting a remodeling project. I therefore had no idea where I might find AA batteries when my Mac warned me that the mouse was getting low on juice. When I saw that Prime Now could deliver them to me in hours, I ordered an 8-pack of Amazon Basic batteries at about 9 a.m. this morning. At 11:01, Claire went nuts when a friendly delivery guy showed up at the door with a brown shopping bag containing the batteries. There was a delivery fee of $5, but also a promo code credit for the same amount. Maybe that was because it's the first time I've used Prime Now. And I did opt online to tip the delivery man $5. It helped that the checkout information stated that my entire tip would go to the delivery person. He seemed to be driving his own car to make some money delivering Amazon products. Maybe it was part of that Amazon Flex program. In any event, Prime Now is pretty amazing. It's available in 31 cities, including Denver. Today marks 2 weeks until Black Friday, and Amazon is already generating coverage of notable sales on devices. I received a Highland email from the company this week announcing the deals that will be offered as part of Black Friday sales. Starting November 19th, the Kindle Paperwhite will be $30 off, selling for $90. And starting Thanksgiving Day, November 23rd, Amazon Cloud Cam will be $20 off, selling for $100. The Echo Plus will be $30 off, selling for $120. The Fire 7 will be $20 off, selling for an amazing $30. And the Fire HD 8, which is a really fantastic tablet that I use a lot when I'm reading during the day and watching TV and movies and stuff, that will be $30 off, selling for $50. I also love the Fire HD 10, which doesn't have a deal going now, but if you spot one, you might want to take a look at it. It's a beautiful big tablet. I use it for reading magazines, and when I'm reading a Kindle book and there's a chart, I can zoom in and get such a good big view of it on the page. It's really a delight. For the first tech tip, I will have a link to a Good E Reader video forwarded to me by listener Dan Campbell. It reports that Audible is going to be available by Bluetooth for the entry-level Kindle and the first-generation Oasis. That capability was one of the big improvements in the all-new Oasis that was just announced. So far, the Paperwhite and Voyage have not been tapped for the firmware update that will enable Audible, but they have a Bluetooth chip in them, so that should be possible. It's a good video by Michael Kozlowski at Good E Reader. By the way, I want to thank those of you who responded to my request for feedback last week about doing tech tips on devices other than the Kindle. The unanimous counsel that you offered was, yes, you enjoy hearing about Alexa, tablets, and other Amazon gadgets as well as the Kindle, so I will continue to follow my nose and try to offer you a variety of tips that I hope will be helpful to you. To that end, I do want to talk about Alexa. there is this ability to recognize specific voices in your household now. Amazon has a helpful video that describes the procedure. I didn't find the procedure completely intuitive. I was rushing a little to get this ready for you on the show, but I did try it out with Darlene, and if you want to walk through it, I recommend that you search out that link in the show notes. I already had trained Alexa to recognize my voice when we were up in Maine, so today I asked Darlene to do the same. We're both in stages of exhaustion after our 5 days of babysitting, but she always rises to the occasion and helps me out with a demo on the show. You have to say some phrases to have Alexa learn the voice, and here's a little bit of what we were doing downstairs when we tried this.
Alexa, put on some popular 80s songs. Alexa, connect me to my sister. Alexa, buy a steel thermostat.
Once Darlene recited all of those phrases, which were appearing on her iPhone in the Alexa app, it was walking her through the phrases. Then there was a point where it was obvious that she had been paired. In other words, Alexa could recognize her voice and distinguish it from mine. What that's good for is not completely clear in our usage. One thing that did work that we tried is Darlene asked Alexa to read her Audible books, and it recognized her, and it came up with the last book that she was reading up at Ocean Park when she was listening to Audible books using an Echo there at the cottage. We could also have Alexa remember which music Darlene likes and which things that she's buying. A lot of uses for Alexa that we don't actually use now, like messaging and calls. Once we get a little more adept at some of those activities using Alexa, I think this business to recognize the voice is going to be useful. The last tech tip comes from Steve Lehos, something I didn't know. If you have special offers on your Kindle or a Fire, I think it's the same thing, you can pay to have it removed. It's about $20. Or, it turns out, Steve learned this in a Reddit post, you can simply contact Amazon by chat or phone and ask to have them removed, and they won't charge you. He did this, and it worked just fine. So that's something to try if you've been getting irritated with those special offers, but you didn't want to pay any extra money to have them removed. If you call nicely, you can get them removed, it turns out. Good tip. Carlina Duan is a 2015 graduate of the University of Michigan with a BA in English and Creative Writing. Her debut poetry collection will be published November 14th by Little A. That's the literary imprint of Amazon Publishing. In 2016, she taught in Malaysia as a Fulbright grant recipient, and this fall she started work on a 2-year Master of Fine Arts, or MFA, degree in poetry at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. She's one of 3 poets enrolled in her MFA class at Vanderbilt. I connected by Skype with Carlina in Nashville on Monday, November 6th, and I began by asking her to read one of the poems that I thought would give you a good taste for the work from her new book.
This poem is actually a reimagining of the Pledge of Allegiance. And so I had written, there's another poem in the book earlier that is also a Pledge of Allegiance to my mother, and this one comes at the very end of the book. Pledge 2.0, Tribe, Zoo. I get up, I eat, I rinse my mouth, I squeeze the juice, I play with hair, all of it mine, all of it a cape, black, chasing freckles down my neck, chasing freckles down the tender back. Outside, a bee shimmers past, my knees crack, the grass and its sharp green flags, the woman and her sharp green laugh. I pledge allegiance to the grass of the United States of America. I pledge allegiance to breath, one nation, hills and hills of skin, the body for which I stand, my own animal, my own paws. In the grocery aisle, I claim plums like stars. Look at me, black-haired and bursting. I have black hair on my fist. These are my arms. This is my nation. Look at me. I look at you. Bless all of this looking, crooking under eye after starry eye, indivisible, two-toned.
It's powerful.
Thank you.
That poem struck me as a sample of there's kind of a manifesto feel to your book of asserting your experience as a Chinese American woman and what does it mean to be an American girl. And do you have any other way of thinking of the book as a whole as to what you're offering readers in releasing this particular collection of poems?
I think that you're spot on in terms of thinking about the question of what does it mean to be quote unquote American. And I thought a lot about, in this particular collection, about code switching. When I was writing this book, I was thinking a lot about the ways in which my family and I communicate to each other, and how ever since I've grown up, there has always been that kind of spilling over of English and Chinese and that overlap between the two, and how I didn't really see that necessarily represented in the literature that I was reading when I was growing up. And so I was thinking a lot about what does it mean to code switch linguistically, but also what does it mean to code switch in a body? What does it mean to switch between kind of an all-American sphere of seeing versus being quote unquote all Chinese? And something that I struggled with at first in thinking about putting the book together was, do I have to kind of bend myself and be explicitly just all English or explicitly just all Chinese? And I wanted to kind of merge the two and think about nationhood and think about Americanness as something that doesn't necessarily need to be monolithic in that way. And so I think with this particular collection, I Wore My Blackest Hair, I was thinking a lot about kind of the merging and sort of the dualness of being from and of two cultures and two languages, and thinking about that too as just one way of living the Asian American experience, not the way, but just kind of one way of what it means to be in a body that is Chinese American, bilingual, and from the Midwest.
So code switching, is that a reference to like codes that spies use in espionage, or what's the
Sure, yeah. So code switching is actually a linguistic term, and it's used to talk about when a bilingual speaker will switch between one language register, for example, English, into another, example, Mandarin Chinese. But the way that it's talked about in linguistics is usually that there's this unconsciousness on the part of the speaker who's doing it. And so they don't necessarily realize. I could be talking to you and I could say, hi Len, 我今天 am very excited. And so I just said, hi Len, today I'm very excited. But if I was sort of speaking with another bilingual Chinese speaker, there's something in my brain that doesn't necessarily need to consciously make the effort to create that switch. And so that's where the term originates from. And I think I've taken some liberties with it in thinking about sort of code switching on a more metaphorical lens, kind of code switching the body, as I said earlier, and code switching kind of culturally what that means as well.
So when you were growing up, were you speaking Chinese at home?
Yeah, so actually Chinese was my very first language. I was born in Seattle, Washington, but I didn't really learn English until I entered, I think it was kindergarten or maybe preschool. And so I grew up speaking Chinese, and by the time I entered school, I was, bringing English back home at the dinner table. And eventually, I think it got to a point where my English became way more fluent than my Mandarin Chinese. And so at this point, I'm still relatively fluent in Chinese, although I have an American accent, which my family finds hilarious. And I can understand very, very fluidly. I can understand very well. But in terms of speech, I mostly speak English at home, and then I will code switch from English into Chinese.
Now, the material in the book is it's beautiful and it's challenging and powerful. And I often wondered, what does your mother think of if she's read these poems? Because they're kind of raw, and she's actually kind of a force or a character in a lot of your description of what your life is like. How challenging was that part of it, to go public with poems that have such kind of an intimate connection with your family?
Hugely challenging for me. I think it can be really fraught to write about family, particularly when you're the daughter of two immigrants that, I love both of my parents fiercely beyond measure. And my mom, she has not read every single poem in this collection, actually. She's read a few, including Pledge 2.0. She's read that one. But my mom and my father both, they've been very supportive of my work, but always relatively from a distance. And I think with my mother, as an immigrant from China, she has full fluency over English, but there's also a layer of distancing with the poems being written in English, in which, as a foreign English speaker, that I think it's sometimes difficult for her to grasp sort of the nuances and the twists and the turns. In terms of my family thinking about my own writing, I think they're reluctantly permiss it. And so I remember a conversation that I had with my mother about 2 or 3 years ago where she was like, why can't you just write poems about trees? Why can't you just write the nature poem? I don't like it when you write about our family. And that very act, I think, of putting something that feels very intimate and very, especially in Chinese culture, your family affairs, you don't want to take that out on the table. And when my mom and I talked about it, I was sort of like, well, Mom, as a writer, I think one of the things that is important for me is to just be honest to the work of living and the work of my life. And in order to do that, so much of my own experiences as just a citizen in the world have been shaped and influenced by interactions with my family. And kind of even beyond that, I think growing up, it was hard for me to find literature that kind of represented family dynamics the ways in which they exist in my own world. And so we kind of discussed that. And I think my parents, they know that writing is something that is my life and I care deeply about. And they're always kind of like, you do your thing and go for it. But my mother has yet to read every single poem in this collection. And I'm not sure if she ever will.
Yeah, that sounds like an appropriate distance to be supportive, but not to get so close to it that maybe it might burn a little.
Right.
How about your poetic influences? I mean, I sometimes hear kind of resonances of Whitman in the way you write. Are there other American poets that have so far played a role in you finding your voice?
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting that you bring up Whitman. I was just reading him recently for actually a class that I'm taking in the MFA program here. Yeah, I think that for me, there are a few different kind of contemporary poets whose work really resonates with me. One of them being Aracelis Girmay. She has a book called The Black Maria and another book called Teeth. And the way that she writes is, for me, incredibly tender and full of this empathy for kind of the connection of both the animalistic and the human that I find really interesting. And I think she takes a lot of risks in her work, both formally, like on a page, and kind of thinking about a collection of poems as a whole, as an entire kind of living, breathing creature. And I find her work super inspiring. There's also a collective of poets, younger poets of color, and they're called the Dark Noise Collective. And they're composed of, I think, 6 poets: Jamila Woods, Franny Choi, Aaron Samuels, Nate Marshall, Dinez Smith, and Fatima Asghar. They're producing just really compelling work with language and kind of the urgency of language in English, and sort of what does it mean that language can operate on the level of erasure and violence, but also love and joy. And so I find a lot of power in their work, and also in just thinking about forging literary community. They offer a lot of, I think, modeling for me as sort of a collective of poets who are both mentors to each other, readers to each other, and also friends. And that's something that, for me, is really, really inspiring as a student of poetry. So those are kind of the big ones, yeah.
You have taught writing, I think maybe on the Fulbright experience in Malaysia and in other settings. When I talk to my young nephews, I've got one that just proudly says he's never read a book and he doesn't think it's important. He can get around the internet and he knows video games. Do you have to make the case actually not just for poetry, but for taking the time to write well among students of a certain age?
Yes, absolutely. So I think that with a lot of students, kind of the struggle, even for myself when I was younger, the struggle was seeing writing as something that was even relevant to the world that we're living in today. I think that the ways in which writing is sometimes taught in schools can be more formulaic at times. And I think that at least when I was younger, there was frequently like a failure to find that window of how does writing relate to my world, and how can writing feel like a form of play? Like, what is there accessible about Shakespeare, Dickinson, or even Whitman that I can find a place in my heart to really care about or love? And so for me, when I'm teaching writing, especially to younger students, I would say I've worked a lot with middle schoolers in the past, and I think that is an age in which students they have so much tucked inside of them, but it's hard for them to figure out, why should I even care? And I think one of the challenges then is figuring out, well, what do you care about? If not for writing, then what's something that you're passionate about? What's something you have a question about? And showing them that writing, to me, like writing is one of the most exciting ways of exercising your brain, because you're not just in a space where there is a black and white answer. It's not like math in which, there's a correct answer, there's a wrong answer. I think with writing, you could be a writer and you could be a gardener or a fireman or a mathematician all at the same time. There's that simultaneous existence of so many things in writing, and it really forces you to kind of cultivate yourself to go out in the world and try something new. So I say to my students a lot, like, well, if you like basketball, then great, you're going to be the perfect writer because you have something to say, you have something to write about. And I think the other part of students maybe being hesitant with writing is that they feel like, especially young students, might feel like their voices don't matter. And I think there's a lot culturally that tells them that, shut up, like you're just a little child, like we don't want to hear you. And the really powerful thing with writing is that I think it can offer students a way to kind of amplify themselves and write themselves into existence. That for me, growing up was so powerful. And that's one of the reasons why I love teaching writing, and I love being in the classroom, and watching students maybe have their hearts and their brains kind of come alive on a page.
I took an MFA at Bennington about 13 years ago in poetry, and had quite an aspiration to be a poet. It was a second career for me. I just got tired of how few people seemed to be reading poetry and how hard it was to get published in literary magazines. And even if you did, the feeling that all of the magazines were being subscribed to by other poets who were trying to publish in them as opposed to a general audience. And so I drifted off into, podcasting, but more into prose. And I've read some of your columns that you wrote when you were at Michigan. You're a very strong prose writer as well. And I'm wondering if you really think you'll be able to focus on poetry, given the relatively small impact it makes in the world of letters compared with, powerful nonfiction or fiction or parts that just have more of a reach at this point.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. That's something that I've been thinking a lot about myself, especially in the past year or so. I think that for me, the exciting thing about poetry for me is that I think my brain kind of moves in a different way, and I'm able to express a story in a very different way than I would be able to in prose. And at least in my life currently, that there are so many stories and so much collage work that I feel happens in my brain with a poem that I want to kind of keep focused on in the world of poems. That said, I love prose writing and I love nonfiction. And something that I've been thinking a lot about in the MFA is I think it's really useful for writers to be able to have their kind of tools spread across different mediums. And so for me, I think my past prose and my past journalistic projects have really influenced the way that I think about poetry and the way that I'm constructing even a sentence or breaking a line in the poem. And something that I really want to experiment more with while I'm in my MFA program is writing more nonfiction and writing more prose and not necessarily limiting myself to just the world of poetry. I mean, I think that poetry is a very useful tool to kind of navigate the world with, and that it offers a lot of windows of reflection and resistance and hope in all of these ways. But I also think that with prose, that there's something more fluid to me and sort of blocky about my thought process that I find also really challenging and really stimulating. And I think that kind of moving forward, even beyond the MFA, I think that for me, it would be perhaps foolish if I just kind of penned myself into one box of poetry. That said, I love poems and I just love words in general. And so I think I would be interested in sort of expanding and leaking myself outside of just poetry.
Well, I'm very interested in how your book came to be published by Little A, the literary imprint of Amazon Publishing. And I thought maybe you had published something in Day One, the literary magazine, but I wasn't able to find. There wasn't a way to search all of the back issues for a single poet. But can you just tell the story of what led you to being within a week or so of they're publishing your book?
So I was not actually published in Day One. I found out in 2015, I think it was right after I had graduated college, a friend sent me a link to a poetry competition. And it was an emerging poets manuscript competition that was being judged by Kimiko Hahn and Cornelius Eady, and they were two poets that I really, really admired. And so I submitted a manuscript, which at the time was mostly a compilation of poems from my senior thesis at the University of Michigan. And I remember I was reading the submission guidelines, and Morgan Parker was one of the editors, and she was also another poet that I just really fiercely respected. So I sent it in, and I wasn't necessarily expecting to hear back. I was actually in Malaysia, and I got an email from Morgan saying that I had made it to the finalist round of this competition. And so that was really exciting for me. And then kind of fast forward a couple of months, Morgan reached out to me and said that while I hadn't been selected as the winner of the competition, she still wanted to publish my book under Little A. And that is kind of how the entire thing ended up coming together. So it was really humbling process because I had just kind of been fresh out of school at the time, and terrifying and so exciting. But yeah, so it's coming together and it's happening.
And now, is she the editor of Little A at this point?
So Morgan is not the current editor anymore. My current editor is Vivian Lee. I think Morgan just left a few months ago. And so now I have a new editor who will help kind of get this little book out into the world in, like you said, in about a week.
What sort of a plan do they have to spread the word about the book? They reached out to me in a way that was effective and got my interest. I hope there's been other media interest or a book tour. What's the nature of it going to be in the next few weeks?
Sure, yeah. So in terms of the next few weeks, I myself have a couple of book readings scheduled throughout different cities. And so I just had one in Nashville on Friday. And I'm going to have a release party back in Michigan, in Ann Arbor, in December, on December 14th. Little A has been really supportive and kind of reaching out to a ton of different media platforms and also writing organizations that I'm really interested in. They reached out to Asian American Writers Workshop, and so I'll be having a reading with them on December 18th in New York City. They have a publicity team that I've actually been working with, and it's my first time working with a publicity team, so it's quite exciting and new. And so their role is kind of to scour media outlets and help kind of get the book out there, send copies of the book elsewhere, and get people excited and interested. Also, Goodreads is doing a digital giveaway of I Wore My Blackest Hair from now until November 13th. So anyone can sign up, enter for a free copy. I think they're giving out 100 copies. And so you just enter and get randomly selected and hopefully win.
When I was doing my MFA at Bennington, self-publishing hadn't really been invented yet. It was still, Vanity Press was the only thing you could do if you weren't chosen by an agent and a publisher. But in your current MFA community, is that changing? Are people seeing self-publishing as a more respectable path forward toward publication than would have been the case 5 or 10 years ago?
Yeah, I think that self-publishing, I think the world of publishing is really interesting because there is, at least among my MFA cohort and I think I talk a lot about how there seems to be gatekeeping at times within the publishing world. And I think if you're in an MFA program, you automatically, there are a lot of resources and time that you have kind of ingrained within, your studies to be able to submit to journals, established journals or established presses. On the other hand, I think that self-publishing is sort of opening up the realm for folks who might not have those resources or that time, or even the knowledge about how the publishing world works, maybe, to be able to access a way to get their voices kind of published out in the world more. So I think in terms of MFA, my MFA colleagues and I think we are mostly submitting to journals or to presses that already exist. However, I think that there is this thread of, if self-publishing is opening up the window a little bit more for other writers who might not be historically represented in the publishing world, for them to be able to make it and to have their voices be heard, then I think that's not a bad thing at all. I think that's really exciting.
I think it's going to be very interesting to see how they do with your book, a book of contemporary poetry, because I think there's some kind of antipathy toward Amazon in a lot of literary circles. I think that people within the literary world tend to think, oh, Amazon publishing, it's not self-publishing. It's highly curated publisher like any others, but they're mainly about mysteries. They're mainly about romance or whatever, that a real literary work. In fact, I had a bookstore owner explain why he doesn't really look to Amazon publishing lists for his books. And I have a feeling that because of the savvy that Amazon publishing and the team have there of connecting a book of any genre with readers through the internet and through different things, that they could conceivably establish themselves as a quite viable way for literary writers to connect.
I think that there is a pulse of tech savvy knowledge that Amazon has in terms of knowing how to curate a readership. And they have a very, at least in my experience from working with them, that there's a very methodical way of imagining kind of a readership and sort of asking me as the writer, well, who do you perceive to be your readers? I was asked that question, which I thought was a really important question. And working with indie presses in the past, they've asked me that question as well. And I think even, a huge kind of, I don't even know how to describe Amazon. I guess I would say that they're just a huge conglomeration like Amazon, that they would know how to kind of ask those pretty, intimate questions. Who do you imagine your readership to be? Describe your book in maybe even like 2 lines as if you would to a close friend, as if you would to a colleague. I think those kinds of questions that are geared towards shaping audiences are really important. Even the act of asking a question like that to a writer, I think is really important. And so I'm not sure about like the future of Amazon in the literary world at large. I do think that for my book, it's been really interesting working with them and being able to answer those questions and also to challenge myself to think more about, how do I see this book existing in the world and what kind of spaces do I want it to enter and what kind of people do I want it to encounter? And I think that working with Amazon has been interesting in that way because they do have a very broad reach, and I think they do have a very established method and established way of doing things that for me has given a lot of structure to thinking about the book being out in the world. And also I think there's been a more organized sort of timeline in sort of thinking about these things as well. Not to say that I wouldn't have gotten that from an independent press. I think I definitely would. I think I was surprised by the amount of sort of structure and maybe the weird amount of intimacy that I felt too. And part of that too is just when Morgan Parker was the editor, she worked primarily with me on editing most of the manuscript. And so we had many a phone conversation, even when I was in Malaysia, and those felt very personal in a way that maybe I was not expecting initially, but was surprised by and excited about.
Yeah, she seems like a really talented editor. I had her on the show once, and her passion for literature, and I can imagine her being a very proactive person to work with as an editor. Yeah, absolutely. And she really was. And we actually bring her up in my MFA workshop sometimes because she's worked with other writers that are currently at Vanderbilt.
And our quote, kind of our Morgan quote, is when she's very adamant about, like, say the damn thing is sort of a Morgan line that we love to use in workshop. And so she'll kind of operate as sort of a poetry god in the backgrounds of our classroom, which is really lovely. Yeah.
I have been speaking with Carlina Duan, author of I Wore My Blackest Hair, her debut poetry collection available for pre-order with publication by Little A on November 14th. Thanks very much, Carlina. Thank you so much, Len. It was great to talk to you. I have a few items in content, starting with an interesting ebook subscription service for Polish Kindle books. I heard about this from listener Shimon Schott, and you will find a link in the show notes describing it. The service is named Legimi, spelled Legimi, and it offers subscribers access to more than 20,000 books. You have to connect your Kindle to a PC by USB cable in order to obtain the content. A Mac version is coming soon. This is an interesting development given the demise of the elegant-looking Oyster ebook subscription service in the U.S. A while back, and the domination of Amazon's Kindle Unlimited subscription. In Poland, some creativity appears to have enabled a subscription service that actually makes books available to read on Kindle without signing up for Kindle Unlimited. Recently, Legimi increased the number of books available each month through the service. If you are looking for a good book to read, Amazon's book editors have released their best books of 2017. The number one pick is a book that I hadn't heard of yet, Killers of the Flower Moon, The Osage Murders, and the Birth of the FBI. That's by David Grann, published by Doubleday. If you guess being published by one of the big five means the Kindle version is no bargain, you're right. Tonight it's listed at $14.99, or just 27 cents less than the paperback price at Amazon.com. I received an interesting story via Mark Jarvis in London. The site is openculture.com, and the headline is "The Internet Archive, quote, liberates books published between 1923 and 1941 and will put 10,000 digitized books online." It says that there is a little-known and perhaps never-used provision of U.S. copyright law, Section 108H, which allows libraries to scan and make available materials published from 1923 to 1941 if they are not being actively sold. This is from the site's founder, from the Internet Archive, who are apparently going to be putting this up. The story describes exactly how this kind of loophole has been taken advantage of or used, I think, for good purpose. These are books that aren't being sold, and they can now be made available for free, and they'll be coming out at the Internet Archive. So good article, and I'll have a link to it in the show notes. I love seeing books that are locked down by the kind of crazy copyright laws that we've got in the U.S., finding a way out into the light. That's a good thing. That's it for this week. The very first Kindle was introduced 10 years ago on November 19th. That's coming up next week. And to celebrate the milestone, I'm very pleased to report that my guest for next week's show will be Steve Kessel, the Amazon Senior Vice President who led the team that created the original Kindle. I also want to express gratitude to all the veterans in the audience as we come up on Veterans Day tomorrow. I think in particular my friend Jack in Casper, Wyoming, 91 years old, who served in the Pacific when he was a young man just out of high school, and he's one of the last veterans of World War II in Casper. Works at there's a museum at the airport because it used to be an air base where tens of thousands of airmen were trained in Casper in the war, and Jack volunteers out there at a museum. Jeff Bezos had a tweet noting the number of veterans that are employed at Amazon. He set a very ambitious goal for employing veterans, and looks like they're on track to achieve it. Sometimes I like to include audio in the podcast that serves as a personal archive. Since all these episodes get saved all the way back almost 10 years now, I can go back and hear my grandson James or my dad. And so this will be some audio that I'll remember from the week that Darlene and I spent 5 days just across the fence in the backyard here taking care of Ryan and Jake. And this is in Ryan's room. He's going to be 2 in January.
Do you like books?
Yeah.
Yeah, me too.
Me too.
Me too. What do you like?
I
like books.
Book.
Book. reach in the sleep sack first. Okay, here you go. Did I wipe? Yeah, I think I wiped. Okay. All right. Where's the arms? Good. Arms going there. Yeah. Now we gotta do the zipper. We gotta do the zipper. All right. What's next? What do we got?
Book?
A book?
Yeah.
Yeah. What's next?
Book?
Okay. Let's go read the book.
Book?
Yeah. Read the book.
Book?
Yeah.